The carriage lurched over another rut in the estate road, and Margaret Ellsworth pressed her gloved hand against the cool window glass. Beyond it, Ashford Hall materialized through the November mist, like something conjured from a Gothic tale, all soaring grey stone and narrow windows that seemed less like portals to light and more like eyes watching her approach. She had known this was coming. For 3 years, since her father's fortunes had begun their quiet collapse, she had sensed the direction of her future shifting like the tides. But knowing and experiencing were two entirely different things. The letter had arrived on a Tuesday morning, sealed with a ducal insignia that seemed to burn on the vellum. Her father had read it twice before looking up at her, and in that moment Margaret had understood that her girlhood, what little remained of it, had just ended. The Duke of Ashford required a wife, not desired, required. The letter had been written in such formal language that one might forget it concerned a living, breathing person, that being her. She was an acceptable candidate, reasonably educated, of adequate breeding despite her family's financial difficulties, and here her father's voice had faltered slightly, not unmarked by illness in a way that would be apparent to polite society. The Duke valued discretion. It was the most unromantic proposal in the history of marriage proposals, and yet, when her father had suggested she might refuse, Margaret had found herself unable to summon the rebellion required. What was she refusing? A lifetime of genteel poverty with her aunt, a slow descent into spinsterhood, watching younger girls with properly funded dowries marry while she embroidered handkerchiefs for a living. The Duke of Ashford was offering her security. If his reputation was dark, if people whispered about the tragedy that had marked him, the wife he had lost 5 years prior, the way he had seemingly withdrawn from all human connection, well, that was not her concern. She was marrying a position, not a man, or so she had told herself. The carriage rolled to a stop before the entrance, and Margaret gathered her composure as she would gather her shawl. This was her wedding day. It was customary, she supposed, to feel something. Joy, perhaps. Trepidation, certainly. But all she felt was a profound numbness, as if she were observing herself from a great distance. A footman opened the carriage door. Margaret arranged her travelling gown, dove grey, suitably respectable, and descended with the careful deliberation of someone walking across a frozen pond, uncertain if the ice would hold. The hall's entrance was vast, cold, echoing with the absence of warmth. This was not a home. It was a mausoleum, and there, at the base of the great staircase, stood the Duke. Margaret's breath caught, though she could not have explained why. His portrait had hung in the Ellsworth sitting room for months, a formal thing with all the personality of a marble bust. It had not prepared her. In person, the Duke of Ashford was a study in controlled severity. Tall to the point of intimidation, dressed in black coat and dove-grey waistcoat, with dark hair that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. But it was his eyes that stopped her, slate-grey, penetrating, examining her with the intensity of a man reading ancient inscriptions, hoping to decode some terrible truth. He descended the stairs with measured steps. Each footfall sounded final. "Miss Ellsworth," he said. His voice was exactly as she had imagined, low, measured, carrying the weight of command without requiring volume. "You have arrived." Not a question, an observation. "Yes, Your Grace." She performed the required curtsy, holding it perhaps a fraction longer than necessary, because she could not quite manage to meet those examining eyes. When she rose, she found he had stepped closer. Not too close, propriety forbade it, but close enough that she could smell the faint scent of tobacco and something else, something that reminded her inexplicably of autumn rain. "The vicar is prepared. We shall dispense with prolonged courtesies." He studied her face as if searching for some hidden defect. "Unless you find yourself unable to proceed." It was a test. She was certain of it. He was giving her one final opportunity to refuse, perhaps hoping she would. And in that moment, Margaret understood something crucial. This man did not want this marriage any more than she did. "I am prepared, Your Grace," she said, and watched something flicker across his expression. Not relief, not disappointment, but something more complicated. Something that looked almost like resignation. "Very well," he said, and offered his arm, not his hand. His arm extended with the stiffness of a man offering a stranger passage through a doorway. "Let us conclude this arrangement." As she placed her hand upon his sleeve, Margaret could feel the tension in his muscles, the rigid control he was exerting over himself. He was not nervous. Nervousness would have been too human. He was braced, as if preparing himself for something inevitable and distasteful. The chapel was small, intimate in a way that felt isolating rather than romantic. The vicar conducted the service with admirable efficiency, and Margaret heard herself say words that would bind her to this man for life. When it came time for him to speak, the Duke's voice remained level, his eyes never wavering from the stained glass window above the altar. She was not even certain he had looked at her. The rings were exchanged. His ring, cold from sitting untouched, slipped onto her finger with a finality that made her chest tighten. His was already on, she noticed, on the opposite hand from where she had been told it would be. The signet ring gleamed with the weight of centuries, while on the other hand sat a band of black iron, thin and severe. When the vicar pronounced them married, the Duke released her hand with the same precise control with which he had taken it. "Come," he said, and began to walk toward the chapel door. "There are matters requiring attention." Margaret followed, her new husband striding before her with the gait of a man who tolerated her presence, but certainly did not welcome it. She had married the Duke of Ashford, and he had married her as one might accept a necessary surgical procedure, with resignation, endurance, and the fervent hope that it would be concluded swiftly and without incident. The afternoon light was fading when Margaret was shown to the Duchess's chambers. The suite was beautiful. She could not deny that. Pale silk wallpaper, furnishings of mahogany and satin, a fireplace where flames danced with a warmth that somehow failed to penetrate the room's fundamental coldness. Her trunks had been unpacked by efficient servants who had neither smiled nor spoken beyond the bare necessities of their task. The mistress of the wardrobe, a severe woman named Mrs. Hartley, had arranged Margaret's things with the precision of someone executing a military operation. "The Duke," Mrs. Hartley said, her thin mouth somehow managing to purse even further, "does not favor extended dinner engagements. Dinner is served at 7. You will be expected to be present and punctual. His Grace prefers conversation limited to essential matters." "I see," Margaret said, though she did not see anything clearly anymore. Everything existed in a kind of fog. "The nursery—" Mrs. Hartley paused, and Margaret felt something sharp pierce the numbness in her chest. "That is, were there to be children, provisions are made. But His Grace has been quite clear that he does not, that is to say, the East Wing remains closed." The meaning was unmistakable. Whatever arrangement had been made between them, it did not include the intimacies of marriage. She was being housed as a spouse in name only. Margaret should have felt relief. Instead, she felt something far more complicated, something that tasted faintly like shame, though she could not articulate why. When she came down to dinner, dressed in the black gown she had been given for the evening, a color selected by the household, not by her own choice, the Duke was already seated. He did not rise when she entered, which was a small breach of custom, but she suspected she would learn that small breaches of convention were characteristic of him. The dining table stretched between them like a chasm. Servants moved silently, delivering and removing courses with choreographed precision. The Duke ate methodically, without apparent pleasure or complaint. "The household staff," he said, his eyes on his wineglass rather than on her, "are accustomed to efficiency. I trust you will not require extensive changes to their routines." "I have no wish to disrupt the household's operations," Margaret replied. It was safe, bland, exactly the sort of response a new duchess should make. "My mother resides in the East Wing," he continued. "She maintains her own circle and her own interests. You are not required to spend time with her, though she may impose her presence upon you periodically. I would suggest you develop tolerance for her company quickly. She is exacting in her standards." Margaret thought of her own mother, warm, ineffectual, prone to tears when circumstances became difficult. Lady Ashford, from what she had gathered, was the opposite in every way. "And yourself?" The words emerged before Margaret could consider whether asking them was wise. "What shall I call you, Your Grace?" "In private, I mean to say." The Duke's fork paused mid-gesture. When he looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time since the chapel, Margaret felt her breath catch. In his eyes, she glimpsed something vast and dark and terrible, a grief so profound it seemed to swallow light. Then he blinked, and the moment was gone. He was simply the Duke again, controlled, distant, impenetrable. "Your Grace will suffice," he said flatly. "I see no need for greater familiarity." The words landed like stones. Margaret felt them settle in her chest, heavy and immovable. After dinner he stood. "I trust you will find the accommodations adequate. Should you require anything, there is a bell. The servants will respond." He paused at the doorway, one hand on the frame. "You are not expected to make demands on my time or attention, Duchess, nor are you to interfere in the management of the estate. We shall occupy the same house. We need not occupy the same life." "Yes," Margaret said quietly, "I understand." He did not respond. He simply left, and the dining room became even emptier than it had been before. That night, lying in the vast bed in the Duchess's chambers, Margaret stared at the canopy above her head and felt something crystallize inside her. Not anger, not quite sadness, but rather a crystalline understanding. She had married the Duke of Ashford, and he had made it abundantly clear that the marriage was merely an arrangement of convenience. There was to be no romance, no companionship, no intimacy beyond that required by their positions. She would be the Duchess in title and appearance. She would manage the household, produce an heir if duty required it, and maintain the facade of a proper marriage. But she would do all of this alone. Entirely, utterly alone. In the darkness, Margaret did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears accomplished nothing. Instead, she folded her hands across her chest and began the difficult work of accepting what her life had become. A gilded cage, perhaps, but a cage nonetheless. 3 weeks into her tenure as Duchess, Margaret had established a routine of such rigid precision that it would have impressed a military commander. She rose at 7 o'clock. She attended to her appearance with meticulous care, not for vanity, though she was not above that weakness, but because the Duchess must be correctly presented at all times. A thread of hair out of place was a failure of duty. An ill-pressed gown was a slight against her position. These small things mattered when everything else had crumbled away. The household ran smoothly under her guidance, which was to say it ran exactly as it had before her arrival, since she had made no changes beyond what was strictly necessary. The servants, she had learned, preferred their familiar systems. The Duke seemed to approve of her non-interference through his absolute disregard for her existence. They crossed paths primarily at meals. He was often absent, riding out on the estate, attending to business in his study, or simply vanishing into the library where no one was expected to follow. Margaret had learned not to ask where he went or when he would return. On this particular morning, she was in the small drawing room working on a piece of needlework, nothing so elaborate as the embroidery she had done to survive her father's decline, but rather something fine enough to maintain her position and humble enough to indicate she was not idle. A duchess who did nothing was viewed with suspicion. A duchess who was perpetually engaged in some form of refined labor was properly occupied. A commotion in the entrance hall drew her attention. Voices, which was unusual. The household of Ashford Hall operated in hushed reverence, as if the very walls might shatter if spoken to too loudly. Margaret rose, setting aside her needlework with a care that suggested she might resume it at any moment, and moved toward the doorway. It was not her place to investigate disturbances, and yet she found herself curious despite her better judgment. In the entrance hall, the Duke stood with another man, younger, auburn-haired, with the sort of open, warm expression that seemed to belong to an entirely different species than her husband. Behind them, servants appeared to be attending to a horse. "I cannot believe you did not respond to my letters," the other man was saying, his tone caught somewhere between exasperation and affection. "I had to come see with my own eyes whether you had truly married. And Margaret Ellsworth, no less. Blackstone made a rather unsuitable jest about you finally accepting society's version of your redemption, to which I told him—" The man stopped, apparently noticing Margaret in the doorway. His expression transformed into something warm and welcoming that made her wonder what her own face must look like by comparison. "Good heavens, you must be the new Duchess, Thomas Whitmore, Earl of Blackstone, and entirely at your service." He executed a bow that seemed to contain genuine pleasure rather than mere courtesy. Margaret found herself curtsying, a small sound of acknowledgement escaping before she could contain it. "Lord Blackstone," she said carefully, "you are a friend of His Grace?" "The friend, I would argue," Whitmore said, glancing at the Duke with an expression of affectionate exasperation, "though Alexander doesn't make friendship easy. Doesn't make much easy, come to think of it." The Duke's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Thomas was passing through the county. I invited him to stay for a day or two." This was clearly not true. This man had not been invited. He had simply appeared, driven by the sort of concern that Margaret recognized instantly. He was worried about the Duke. "The Duchess and I must prepare for a private dinner," the Duke said, his tone brooking no argument. "Perhaps you might refresh yourself. Dinner is at 7. It was a clear dismissal, though delivered with the veneer of civility that was all the Duke seemed capable of anymore. Margaret felt Thomas Whitmore's eyes flicker between them, assessing something she was not certain she wanted assessed. "Of course," he said easily, though his expression had shifted into something more careful. I would not dream of intruding upon newlyweds. Though I confess, Alexander, when you said you had married, I did not picture—" He trailed off, seemingly unable to finish his sentence without giving offense. "Well, she is charming. That is what I was attempting to say." After he had been shown to his rooms and the Duke had disappeared into his study with his characteristic finality, Margaret found herself oddly unsettled. The presence of another person in the house, someone who seemed to care about her husband in a way that transcended mere social obligation, had disrupted the careful equilibrium she had established. That evening, dressed in her finest gown, pale green silk that the household dressmaker had assured her was becoming, Margaret took her place at the dining table. To her surprise, the Duke was already there, and he had positioned himself closer to her than usual. Not intimately close, but close enough that his presence felt more substantial than it had in their weeks of marriage. Thomas Whitmore filled the spaces between them with an easy conversation that required neither of them to truly engage. He spoke of London gossip, of mutual acquaintances, of horse races and political developments. It was the prattle of polite society, and yet it created a buffer against the vast silence that usually characterized their meals. Midway through the second course, Margaret's wineglass slipped from her fingers. It fell in seeming slow motion, and she watched with a kind of frozen horror as it tumbled toward the tablecloth, certain that the crash would shatter the fragile peace of the evening. The Duke's hand moved with impossible speed. He caught the glass before it had fallen more than a few inches, his reflexes still sharp despite whatever had softened the rest of him. For a moment, his hand remained there, fingers wrapped around the crystal, and Margaret felt the weight of his gaze upon her. "Are you well?" His voice was different, not warm but perhaps less cold. "Yes," she said, and was surprised to find it was not entirely a lie, simply clumsy. "I apologize." He returned the glass to the table with unnecessary care, and she noticed that his own hand was trembling almost imperceptibly. After dinner, as Thomas was retiring to his room and the Duke was preparing to withdraw to his study, Margaret found herself standing in the hallway between them. "Good night," she said, and wondered if it was her imagination that he paused at the door to his study before continuing inside. The house settled into its familiar silence, and Margaret made her way to the Duchess's chambers. But something had shifted. Some small thing, barely perceptible, like the moment before a storm when the air changes though no clouds have yet appeared. She did not yet understand what it meant, but she felt it, undeniably. Thomas Whitmore's presence in Ashford Hall created ripples that Margaret had not anticipated. Over the 3 days of his visit, the household seemed to breathe differently. Servants moved with less trepidation. Even the Dowager Duchess, who had deigned to grace them with her presence once, had seemed marginally less severe. But more notably, the Duke himself had shifted. He was still controlled, still distant, still prone to his long silences. Yet there were moments, small, barely perceptible moments, when something less forbidding flickered across his features. On the morning of Thomas's departure, Margaret found herself in the small library that adjoined the main drawing room. She had come to collect a book she had misplaced, or so she told herself. In truth, she had come because she had heard voices and found herself unable to resist the pull of their conversation. "You cannot continue like this," Thomas was saying, his usual warmth replaced with something more forceful. "Margaret seems a decent sort, intelligent, tolerant. For God's sake, Alexander, she has made no unreasonable demands. She has done nothing but attempt to be a proper duchess in a household that has given her every reason to despair. That is precisely why this arrangement must remain as it is," the Duke replied. His voice was so low Margaret had to strain to hear it. "She deserves better than what I can offer, better than this." There was a pause. When Thomas spoke again, his voice carried a weight that made Margaret's breath catch. "She deserves," he said carefully, "whatever you are capable of giving. That is the nature of marriage, is it not? Not fantasy, but reality. Not perfection, but presence." "I am already present," the Duke said flatly. "That is the cruelest kindness I can offer." Margaret realized with a jolt of something that might have been guilt that she was eavesdropping. She should leave. She should make noise, return to the hallway, pretend she had never heard words that were clearly not meant for her ears. Instead, she found herself stepping into the library's doorway. Both men turned sharply. Thomas's expression registered surprise and something that might have been sympathy. The Duke's face became an even more impenetrable mask than usual. "Forgive me," Margaret said, and was pleased that her voice remained steady. "I did not intend to intrude. I came seeking a book." "Which book?" Thomas asked, with the ease of a man who had not just been discussing the precise nature of her marriage's inadequacy. Perhaps I might help you locate it. But it was the Duke whose eyes tracked her as she moved further into the room, pretending to scan the shelves. She could feel the weight of his attention like a physical thing, and she had to focus intently on the titles before her to maintain her composure. "What are you reading?" he asked suddenly. It was the first direct question he had asked her in weeks, the first indication that he had noticed her sufficiently to wonder about her activities. "The Tenant of Wildfell Hall," she said, selecting the volume at random. It was not the title she had come seeking, but it was there, and she pulled it free with more confidence than she felt. Lady Catherine recommended it. She said it was quite provocative for modern sensibilities. "Is it?" There was something in the question that suggested he was asking more than he was saying. "Yes," Margaret said, and then, emboldened by she could not say what, she continued. "The heroine is not content with the passive acceptance of her circumstances. She chooses action over resignation. It is refreshing." For a moment the Duke did not respond. Thomas glanced between them with an expression of carefully neutral interest. When the Duke finally spoke, his voice was so quiet that Margaret had to lean forward slightly to hear it clearly. "Such action often brings its own consequences," he said, "consequences that are not always survivable." "Yes," Margaret agreed, meeting his eyes directly, "but perhaps that is a risk worth taking. To be alive even briefly seems preferable to existing in a state of perpetual half-life." Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of something that might have been pain or recognition, or both. He looked away first. "Come," Thomas said, with the air of someone performing a necessary mercy. "Let us not keep the horses waiting. Alexander, I trust you will visit London soon. The season is coming, and there are several people who would welcome the chance to prove that you have not entirely abandoned civilization." The Duke inclined his head in acknowledgement, but his gaze remained fixed on a point somewhere beyond the window. As Thomas took his leave, Margaret remained in the library, the book clutched to her chest. She had seen something in those few moments, a fracture in the facade, perhaps, the smallest indication that beneath the ice something was still capable of being reached. Whether that was cause for hope or merely cruelty, she could not yet determine. Winter descended upon Ashford Hall with the inevitability of mourning, and Margaret found herself settling into the rhythms of a life that was both settled and unsettled. The patterns she had established, the routines, the carefully managed interactions, the spaces she and the Duke occupied at a measured distance, had become the architecture of her existence, and yet something had changed since Thomas's visit. Small things. The Duke would appear in the morning room when she was taking her tea, not to speak necessarily, but simply to be present while she read. He began to ask after her health, her comfort, whether there was anything the household required. These were the minimal gestures of a man performing his duty, and yet they were exponentially more than he had offered before. It was on a particularly grey afternoon in December that Margaret discovered the library adjoining the East Wing, a library that was not marked on any of the household maps she had been given, not mentioned by any of the servants, not indicated in any way as existing. She had been searching for a specific volume, a collection of poetry by Byron that she suspected the household possessed, when she had pushed against what she believed to be a wall and found instead that it yielded to reveal a doorway. The hidden library was small, intimate, lined floor to ceiling with books that bore the marks of being read often rather than displayed for show. The spines were creased, the pages marked and annotated. These were not the carefully curated collections of a family archive, but rather the working library of a person who read as a way of breathing. Margaret moved slowly through the space, reading titles: philosophy, literature, history, poetry, war memoirs, medical texts, letters and journals, leather-bound and labeled with dates that spanned decades, and then, on a shelf at eye level, she found a leather journal marked only with a name and a date: Eleanor, 1818-1823. The handwriting on the spine was elegant but economical, as if the person inscribing it could not bear to waste motion on unnecessary flourish. Margaret's hand moved toward it, then withdrew. Some things, she understood, were not meant to be opened. Some grief was too private, too essential for anyone else to witness. She was turning to leave when she heard the sound of a footstep. The Duke appeared in the doorway, and for a moment neither of them moved. "You found this place," he said. "It was not a question. I was searching for Byron," Margaret said, as if that explained everything. In a way, she supposed it did. "I did not mean to intrude upon what appears to be a private space." He stepped fully into the library, and in the dim light filtering through the single narrow window, Margaret could see the tight control he was exerting over his expression. "My wife," he said, his voice so carefully modulated it might have been machine-made. "Read extensively. Philosophy, poetry, botanical treatises. She had opinions about things, strong opinions, occasionally foolish ones, but honestly held." He moved toward the shelf where Eleanor's journal resided. "She died 6 years ago. Influenza, compounded by a weakness of the chest she had possessed since childhood." The past tense sat heavily between them. "I am sorry," Margaret said, and meant it completely. She understood now the black iron ring on his right hand, understood the way he existed as a man half-inhabited, the minimum required by society, but no more. "You should not come here again," he said, but there was no anger in it. "This place it is not suitable for anyone but myself." "Of course," Margaret said, and moved past him toward the door. But as she reached the threshold, his voice stopped her. "Her name was Eleanor," he said quietly. "She loved these books more than she loved London, more than she loved social position, more, I suspect, than she loved me. I could not compete with the sanctuary these walls provided for her." He paused. "I would not wish that experience upon anyone else." Margaret turned to face him, her heart performing an erratic motion that alarmed her. "I am not Eleanor," she said. It was the most direct thing she had ever said to him. His expression flickered with something she could not pass. "No," he agreed finally. "You are not." As Margaret walked back through the corridors of Ashford Hall, she found herself thinking about Eleanor, this woman who had loved books and ideas, who had been read to death by an illness of the chest. She thought about the Duke, frozen in time, unable to move forward, because moving forward felt like betrayal of the person he had loved. And she thought about what Thomas had said, that Margaret was a decent sort, intelligent and tolerant. That night at dinner, the Duke did something unprecedented. He spoke, not about the weather or the state of the estate, but about a book, a philosophy text that he had been reading, an argument contained within it that he found unconvincing. He asked Margaret's thoughts, not in the manner of someone indulging a child, but as someone genuinely curious about the perspective of another thinking person. Margaret found herself responding with opinions, with thoughts, with the kinds of intellectual engagement she had believed were forbidden in a marriage such as theirs. When the meal ended, the Duke did not immediately rise. Instead, he remained seated, watching her with an expression that was difficult to name. "You are not required to save me, Duchess," he said quietly. "I merely wished that known." "I have no intention of saving anyone," Margaret replied. "I am not anyone's salvation. I am simply a woman who reads and thinks and occupies a space in your house, nothing more." "Perhaps," he said, and there was something almost like sorrow in the word, "that is precisely what I need." After he had left for his study, Margaret sat alone at the dinner table, candlelight flickering across the white cloth, and understood that somewhere in the process of building a life together, separate, distant, carefully bounded, she and the Duke had begun to occupy the same world. It was not redemption, it was not even friendship, not yet, but it was something that felt in the cold silence of Ashford Hall almost like hope. Christmas at Ashford Hall was observed with the precision of a military campaign, though Margaret quickly learned it was a precision born of habit rather than joy. Garlands were hung in the prescribed locations. A tree, sparse, tasteful, entirely without the warmth one might expect from such decoration, was placed in the entrance hall. The servants were given their traditional holiday basket. Everything was correct, and everything was desperately, achingly hollow. The first real snow had fallen 3 days prior, transforming the grounds into something approximating beauty. Margaret had stood at her window watching it accumulate, each flake joining thousands of others, until the entire landscape had been rendered uniform, indistinguishable, erased. The Dowager Duchess had taken it upon herself to visit that morning, arriving with the predictability of a migraine and the warmth of a winter wind. "The household must be properly managed during the festive season," she had announced, settling herself into the chair Margaret had been occupying. "Servants require clear expectations, or they will assume licenses with the traditions that our family has observed for generations." Margaret had listened without comment as the Dowager outlined the exact protocols to be observed, the times of meals, the distribution of charity to the village poor, conducted, Margaret noted, with apparent obligation rather than genuine compassion, the arrangement of the drawing room for visitors who would inevitably arrive, bearing social obligation rather than genuine affection. "Your predecessor," the Dowager had said, the appellation somehow managing to contain disapproval despite its neutrality, was frequently overzealous in her decorating impulses. Eleanor was inclined toward excess. "I trust you will exercise more restraint." This was the first time the Dowager had directly referenced Eleanor, and Margaret had felt something shift in the atmosphere, a small movement of air, as if the house itself had drawn a breath. "Of course, Your Grace," Margaret had replied. "I have no intention of introducing changes that would disturb the household's established traditions." Now, on the afternoon of the winter solstice, Margaret was in the morning room attempting to arrange evergreen branches with a minimalist discipline that she suspected would have displeased Eleanor entirely. The task was occupying her hands, if not her mind, when the Duke appeared in the doorway. He did not announce himself. He rarely did. He simply materialized with the kind of quiet that suggested he had been standing there for longer than she had realized. "The village children are to receive their annual distribution," he said without preamble. "The Dowager has directed that the gifts be limited to practical items, wool, foodstuffs, basic necessities. I suspect she believes joy is somehow frivolous." Margaret set down the evergreen sprig she had been holding. "Surely the children are accustomed to such generosity." "They are accustomed to receiving whatever my mother deems appropriate," he said, and there was the faintest edge to his voice, not quite anger, but something that approximated it. "Eleanor used to include toys, wooden horses, dolls, things that served no practical purpose whatsoever. The children would speak of them for months." He paused, studying a point somewhere above Margaret's head. "My mother found this wasteful." "Did you?" Margaret asked carefully. He turned away, walking to the window. His hands clasped behind his back bore the marks of barely controlled tension. "I found it impossible to object when the alternative was Eleanor's inevitable arguments about the importance of childhood imagination and the cruelty of denying wonder to those who possessed so little else." He was silent for a long moment. "My wife was quite forceful in her convictions, despite her gentle appearance." Margaret understood what he was doing. He was offering information, building a portrait of Eleanor in words, creating a space where her memory could exist without consuming him entirely. It was an act of profound trust, delivered with his characteristic restraint. "Perhaps," Margaret said slowly, "we might find a compromise between your mother's practicality and Eleanor's inclination toward joy." He turned sharply to face her. "You are suggesting that I defy my mother's explicit instructions?" "I am suggesting," Margaret said, straightening her spine as if preparing for battle, "that you are the Duke. Your authority supersedes your mother's preferences, and if I am not mistaken, providing some small measure of delight to children who have little of it seems neither frivolous nor outside the bounds of ducal responsibility." Something flickered across his expression, surprise, perhaps, that she would challenge him. But beneath that, Margaret detected something else, something that might have been approval. "Eleanor would have appreciated your willingness to defy convention," he said quietly. "I am not defying convention," Margaret replied. "I am exercising discretion. Surely that is precisely what a duchess is meant to do, to interpret her husband's wishes in ways that honor both duty and compassion." He studied her for a long moment, and Margaret became acutely aware of the quality of his attention. It was not casual. It was not perfunctory. It was the focused regard of a man examining something that had previously been obscured from his view. "You are not what I expected," he said finally. "Neither are you," Margaret answered. "The Duke of Ashford was described to me as remote, severe, entirely withdrawn from human connection, and while you are certainly stern and frequently distant, I have come to understand that these qualities mask something else entirely." "What would that be?" There was challenge in the question, but it was not aggressive, it was curious. "Kindness," Margaret said simply, "masked by fear of further loss. It is a reasonable disguise, but it is a disguise nonetheless." He left the room without responding, and Margaret returned to her evergreen branches with hands that were trembling slightly. She had said too much. She had overstepped whatever invisible boundaries governed their interaction. But that evening, when she came down to dinner, she found that the Dowager's instructions had been countermanded. The Duke had directed the steward to include toys, simple, handmade things, but toys nonetheless, among the Christmas gifts for the village children, and when Margaret caught his eye across the table, she saw something in his expression that she had not seen before. He was beginning to trust her. Christmas Eve arrived with the kind of cold that seemed to emanate from within rather than from the air. The village children had received their gifts that afternoon. Margaret had accompanied the Duke to oversee the distribution, and she had witnessed something that fundamentally altered her understanding of him. Watching the children's faces as they received the wooden toys, Margaret had observed the Duke standing apart, his expression entirely closed, but his eyes fixed upon a particular child, a girl of perhaps 8 years, with serious grey eyes that matched his own with unsettling precision. When the child had looked up and met his gaze, something had passed between them that Margaret could not name, but could absolutely feel. It was hunger for something lost. It was grief so precisely calibrated that it could be sustained indefinitely without completely consuming him. Later, as they rode back to the hall in silence, Margaret had not asked who the child was. Some things did not require explanation. Now, on Christmas Eve proper, the household had settled into its traditions. A light dinner was served early. The servants had been dismissed to their own celebrations. The drawing-room had been prepared for the evening's observance, a modest affair that would have seemed sparse to most, but which Margaret had come to understand reflected the Duke's preferences rather than any meaningful lack of resource. Margaret was arranging the last of the evergreen boughs, the small act of defiance against the Dowager's minimalism that the Duke had tacitly approved, when he appeared in the doorway. "You are working on Christmas Eve," he said, and there was something almost like disapproval in the observation. "I did not expect you to be occupied with household tasks on a day that is meant to be restful." "The tasks are minimal," Margaret replied, stepping back to assess her work. "And I find the occupation pleasant. It gives one time to think. What are you thinking about?" His tone suggested he was asking a question of genuine interest, not merely making polite conversation. Margaret considered her answer carefully. She was thinking about Eleanor, about the Duke, about the strange architecture of a marriage built from grief and obligation that was somehow becoming something more substantial. She was thinking about the child with the Duke's eyes. She was thinking about the way he had looked at her when she suggested defying his mother, but she said only, "I am thinking about what Christmas must have been like here before." She did not need to specify which era she meant. They both understood that she was referring to the time before Eleanor, the time before loss, the time when the Duke had presumably been capable of experiencing joy. He did not respond immediately. Instead, he moved into the drawing-room and settled himself into a chair with the careful movements of a man whose body carried constant pain. Margaret had noticed this before, the way he occasionally held his left shoulder as if it ached, the slight limp that became more pronounced on colder days. "Eleanor used to sing," he said finally. "Not professionally, you understand. She had no aspirations toward the stage, but she would sit at the piano and sing old country melodies, and she would sing them badly, quite badly in fact, and yet somehow it never mattered." He paused. The Dowager found it undignified. Margaret moved to the piano, an instrument she had not touched since arriving at Ashford Hall. It was a beautiful instrument, well maintained despite its apparent lack of use. "What was her preferred song?" Margaret asked. "The Wayfaring Stranger," he said. "A melancholy thing despite its simplicity, but Eleanor seemed to believe that melancholy was more honest than forced cheerfulness." Margaret lifted the piano's cover, her fingers hovering over the keys. Her own singing voice was adequate, not Eleanor's inferior performance, but certainly not exceptional. Yet she began to play and found herself singing the old melody. "I'm just a poor wayfaring stranger, traveling through this world alone." The words filled the room with a sadness that felt appropriate to the occasion. When she finished, the silence that followed seemed deeper than before. "She would have been amused by your performance," the Duke said. There was something almost like warmth in the observation. "Not because it was poor, it was not, but because you would have had the courage to sing it, while she often did not." Margaret closed the piano and turned to face him. "Why did she lack courage?" "From everything you have told me, Eleanor seemed remarkably strong-willed." "She was strong regarding ideas, principles, matters of philosophy," he said, "but regarding personal expression, regarding the revealing of herself to others, she was profoundly afraid." He met Margaret's eyes directly. "I believe that fear may have hastened her death." Margaret did not fully understand what he was suggesting, but she sensed that explanation was not what he needed in that moment. What he needed was to speak, to be heard, to have his history acknowledged by someone who would not judge. "She refused to see physicians during the influenza," he continued quietly. "She believed that accepting medical intervention was somehow a form of surrender, that if she simply endured the fever with sufficient quiet, it would pass." He stood abruptly, turning away. Her stubbornness killed her as surely as the illness itself. "You blame her," Margaret said. "It was not a question." "I blame myself," he corrected, "for not forcing her to accept care. for allowing my respect for her autonomy to supersede my obligation to preserve her life. Margaret rose and moved toward him without fully considering the appropriateness of such action. "Your Grace," she said, and her voice carried a firmness that surprised them both. "Eleanor made her own choices. You may grieve those choices, but you cannot hold yourself responsible for them." He turned to face her, and Margaret saw that his eyes had become wet, not from tears, but from the terrible effort of containing them. "If I do not hold myself responsible," he said hoarsely, "then I am merely a man who loved someone and failed to save them. That is a burden I am not certain I can bear." "Then perhaps," Margaret said softly, "you need not bear it alone." She did not touch him. The gesture would have been too forward, too presumptuous, but she stood close enough that he would have had to move away from her to create distance, and he did not move away. They stood together in the drawing room as darkness fell outside, the Christmas Eve candles burning down to nothing, two people bound by circumstance and duty who were slowly, carefully, beginning to become something else. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice barely audible, "for singing, for staying, for this." Margaret nodded, understanding that sometimes gratitude was all that could be spoken when words failed. January arrived with a particular kind of bleakness, the novelty of winter having faded, leaving only the tedium of cold, the endless grey skies, the sense that spring was a theoretical concept rather than an actual season that would eventually arrive. It was in this atmosphere of grey monotony that Margaret and the Duke fell into a pattern that was entirely unexpected. It began, innocuously enough, with conversation at dinner, extending beyond its previous duration. The Duke, having discovered that Margaret possessed a working knowledge of both philosophy and literature, began to engage her in actual discourse rather than the minimal civility that had previously characterized their meals. One evening, he disputed her interpretation of a passage from Mill. Another evening, she challenged his assessment of a particular historical event. These were not arguments conducted with heat or malice, but rather the kind of intellectual engagement that Margaret had experienced only with her father, and even then rarely. And gradually, the barriers that had separated them began to soften at the edges. By the second week of January, Margaret found that the Duke was no longer leaving the drawing room immediately after dinner. Instead, he lingered, and they sat together in companionable silence, while Margaret worked at her needlework and he read. It was not intimacy precisely, but it was something closer to companionship than anything she had expected to achieve. The turning point came on a cold evening when Margaret inadvertently observed the Duke attempting to read, despite the presence of what was clearly considerable pain in his shoulder. She said nothing. Having learned that direct inquiries about his physical state were met with deflection, instead she simply rose and moved to stand behind him. "Your Grace," she said carefully, "I wonder if you would permit me a small liberty. I have some knowledge of massage. My mother suffered frequent headaches and I learned certain techniques that provided relief." She fully expected refusal. The Duke was not a man who permitted physical contact, who welcomed the vulnerability of allowing another person access to his body, yet after a long moment of silence, he inclined his head. "Very well," he said, and there was a tremor in the word that suggested it cost him something to agree. Margaret positioned herself behind his chair and placed her hands upon his shoulders with a care that might have been excessive, but which she felt was warranted. Beneath her fingers, she felt the tension that he carried, not just in this moment, but apparently as a constant state of being. She worked carefully, using the techniques her mother had taught her, and within moments she felt some of the rigidity begin to ease. The Duke had gone very still, barely breathing, as if any movement on his part might cause her to withdraw. "How did you sustain this injury?" she asked. Her voice kept deliberately neutral and conversational. "War," he said, and the single word seemed to contain volumes. "A cavalry engagement in Spain before the final defeat of Napoleon. A musket ball. The physicians extracted it, but the damage to the soft tissue was extensive. It has never properly healed." Margaret continued her work, understanding that the pain was not merely physical, but also deeply emotional, that his shoulder bore the marks of a war that had claimed more than his body. "Your friend Lord Blackstone," she said carefully, "carries similar tension. I noticed it when he was staying. Does he also bear the marks of military service?" "Thomas distinguished himself sufficiently that the king's thanks were offered," the Duke said. "But Thomas was fortunate. His physical injuries healed. His emotional ones are another matter." He paused. "We both loved Eleanor. Or rather, Eleanor cared for Thomas's well-being in ways that he repaid with devoted friendship, while I married her," Margaret's hands stilled. She had not known this detail, had not understood that Thomas's concern during his visit had been driven by grief as well as friendship. "She was very beloved," Margaret said softly. "She was," the Duke agreed, "and I was entirely unsuited to loving her as she deserved. I was too rigid, too demanding of perfection, too unwilling to accept that her quiet wisdom was superior to my commanding presence." He turned slightly, forcing her to release him, and looked up at her. "You are not like her. You are stronger in ways that Eleanor was not. You do not withdraw when faced with difficulty." Margaret felt something shift in her chest, some small tectonic movement that would have considerable consequences. "I have never considered myself particularly strong, Your Grace. I have simply accepted circumstance and made the most of it." "That is precisely what strength is," he said. "Not the theatrical kind, but the genuine article, the capacity to continue forward despite the weight one carries." He stood, and Margaret became aware that they were standing very close in the firelit drawing room. There was a moment, suspended, significant, where the space between them seemed to contain infinite possibility. Then the Duke stepped back, his expression closing slightly. "I should retire," he said, his voice returning to its formal register. "The hour is late. You should rest as well." But as he was leaving, he turned back. "Margaret," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name in months, perhaps the first time since their wedding day. "Thank you for your kindness, for not treating this damage as if it defines me entirely." After he had gone, Margaret remained in the drawing room, her hands still tingling from the contact, her heart conducting an erratic rhythm that she could not explain, but which felt dangerously close to hope. She was falling in love with her husband. The realization arrived with the force of an inevitability, as if some part of her had known this would happen from the moment he caught her falling wine glass at dinner. And she suspected, with a mixture of fear and elation, that he was beginning to love her in return. The letter arrived on a morning of particular bleakness, brought by the post with the ordinary efficiency of correspondence that carried extraordinary consequences. The Dowager Duchess's seal was unmistakable. That particular wax, that particular imperiousness. Margaret was in the morning room when the Duke's study door opened with more force than was his custom. She looked up from her correspondence to find him standing in the doorway, the letter in his hand, his expression as dark as she had ever seen it. "My mother," he said, his voice carefully controlled in a way that suggested it was not controlled at all, "has taken it upon herself to invite society to Ashford for a house party in 3 weeks. A celebration of the new marriage, she terms it, though I suspect it is actually an inspection, to ensure that you are adequately performing the role to which you were assigned." "I see," Margaret said, setting down her own correspondence. She did not ask who specifically was being invited, though she suspected Thomas Whitmore would be among the guests. "Is this a tradition that your mother has maintained?" "It is a tradition that would not occur had I any say in the matter," the Duke said curtly. "But the Dowager has apparently decided that you have been sufficiently sheltered from scrutiny and that it is now time for the wider world to assess your suitability." There was something beneath the words, some current of frustration that Margaret did not fully understand. She set down her teacup with deliberate care. "Perhaps you might refuse," she said. "One does not refuse one's mother," he replied, though his tone suggested this was a principle he found profoundly irritating. "The Dowager will interpret such refusal as an indication that something is amiss with the marriage. We have no need to provide fodder for speculation." Margaret rose and moved toward him. "And is something amiss with the marriage?" He turned sharply, and she saw fury in his eyes, but it was not directed at her. It was directed at circumstance, at his mother's interference, at the inexorable march of obligation. "There is nothing amiss," he said, and the words emerged with such intensity that they seemed to contain multiple layers of meaning. "That is precisely the problem. There is nothing amiss because you have demonstrated remarkable tolerance for a marriage that offers you nothing of what marriage should offer. You deserve better than this arrangement." "I deserve what I choose to believe I deserve," Margaret said firmly, "and I chose not to mourn this marriage. I chose to build something from it. Your mother's inspection cannot diminish that." "But society's judgment will," he said, and there was something almost like anguish in the statement. "Society will see you, educated, composed, younger than me, and clearly not madly in love despite the months we have spent together, and they will conclude that I am keeping you imprisoned in this house because I am incapable of offering what a husband should offer. They will look at me and see the beast, not the man." "I do not care what society concludes," Margaret said, "and neither should you. That is easier said than accepted when society controls one's standing, one's prospects, one's very existence, he replied. You are a duchess, Margaret. That position carries obligations that extend beyond your personal inclinations. The use of her given name, twice in recent days, would have warmed her had the circumstances been less fraught. As it was, it only emphasized how deeply he was troubled. What do you fear? She asked quietly. That society will judge you, or that I will judge you. He looked away. I fear that they will judge you, that they will see what I see every time I look at you, and they will recognize that you are wasted in a marriage to a man who is fundamentally incapable of offering what you deserve. What do you see when you look at me? Margaret asked, and her voice carried a steadiness that belied the thundering of her heart. The Duke was silent for so long that Margaret wondered if he would simply leave without responding. But then he turned to face her fully, and in his eyes she saw something that took her breath away. I see a woman who sings on Christmas Eve despite her voice being imperfect, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I see a woman who stands with her hands upon my shoulders without flinching from the damage there. I see a woman who reads and thinks and challenges my assumptions, and who does all of this while being kind about it. I see a woman who has somehow become essential to me in ways that I did not anticipate, and that I am not prepared to bear. Margaret felt tears gathering, though she could not entirely explain their source. Then why, she asked, must you speak of me as if I am a mistake, as if this marriage is somehow a failure? Because I am afraid, he said, the words emerging with evident difficulty. Because I loved Eleanor, and she is gone, and now I find myself loving you, and I cannot bear the thought of losing you as well. I cannot survive that particular loss twice. The room seemed to tilt slightly. He had said it. The confession that had been building between them. The acknowledgement that would fundamentally alter the architecture of their relationship. You cannot protect against loss through the refusal of love, Margaret said gently. Eleanor would have understood that. I understand that. You do not, he said, but there was no heat in it. You cannot. You have not experienced what I have experienced. No, Margaret agreed, but I have experienced this. I have experienced standing in the rain on my father's grave and understanding that some people slip away regardless of how tightly you hold them. And I made an active choice, to love despite that, to believe that the possibility of loss does not negate the value of connection. He moved toward her and Margaret's breath caught. For a moment she thought he might touch her, but instead he reached past her and pulled the bell rope. We will receive your mother's guests, he said, his tone returning to formality. We will present ourselves as a satisfied married couple, because that is what duty requires, and after they leave, we will revisit this conversation. Will we? Margaret asked. Or will you retreat back into the walls you have been carefully constructing? He paused at the threshold. I am endeavoring not to, he said quietly. That is perhaps the most honest thing I can tell you at present. After he had gone, Margaret stood in the morning room and allowed herself the luxury of tears. She was in love with a man who was terrified of love, who had built a fortress of control to protect himself from further loss, and she had no idea how to save him from himself. 3 weeks passed, with the methodical precision of a funeral march. The preparations for the house party consumed considerable attention. The household staff was mobilized, rooms were aired and prepared, the kitchens were informed of the necessity for elaborate menus. Margaret found herself functioning primarily in an administrative capacity, managing the 1,000 small details that made social gatherings possible. She was, in a strange way, grateful for the occupation. It provided purpose and removed her from the necessity of confronting the Duke's deliberate distance. He had not withdrawn to the extent of leaving the house, but he had constructed a careful formality around their interactions that made it clear that his confession had frightened him into defensive retreat. They dined together. They maintained the appearance of a functional marriage. But the moments of genuine connection, the long silences that had become companionable, the conversations that had begun to approach actual intimacy, these had vanished. Margaret told herself this was acceptable. This was the price of honesty. At least now she understood the parameters of her situation. At least now she knew that he cared for her, even if fear prevented him from acting on that care. It did not feel acceptable. On the day the guests began to arrive, Margaret dressed with particular care. The household would be watching, the servants, the visiting society, the Duke himself. She wore a gown of pale blue silk that brought out the grey in her eyes, and she arranged her hair with the precision of someone armoring herself for battle. Thomas Whitmore arrived in the early afternoon. bringing with him a contingent of London society that included 3 unmarried daughters of respectable families, 2 elderly aunts of notable influence, and several gentlemen whose primary occupation seemed to be the discussion of horses and hunting. "Margaret," Thomas greeted her with the easy warmth that came naturally to him, "you look precisely as well as one would expect from a woman married to a man who has been slowly freed from the burden of emotional isolation." She felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Lord Blackstone, I trust your journey was pleasant." "Transparent," he said, with a smile that suggested he intended no unkindness, "but acceptable. Where is Alexander?" "I saw him in the distance as we arrived, and he appeared to be conducting a very thorough inspection of the stables, which I suspect was an effective method of avoiding the necessity of greeting society." "His Grace is occupied with the management of the estate," Margaret said stiffly. "Of course," Thomas said, and his expression shifted into something more serious. "How are matters between the two of you? I mean specifically, not the polite version designed for society." Margaret hesitated. She had no obligation to confide in Lord Blackstone, and yet his clear concern for the Duke made her believe that his question came from genuine interest rather than mere curiosity. "I believe," she said carefully, "that His Grace is endeavouring to reconcile conflicting emotions, and I believe that endeavour is causing him considerable difficulty." Thomas's expression darkened. "He is retreating." It was not a question. Eleanor used to say that Alexander's default response to emotional distress was to barricade himself within increasingly impenetrable walls. "Did he tell you about her? About why he believes himself unworthy of a second happiness?" "He told me that she died of influenza," Margaret said, "and that he blames himself for not forcing her to accept medical care." "That is what he believes," Thomas said quietly. "But the truth is more complicated. Eleanor was dying slowly from the consumption that had plagued her since childhood. The physicians had given her 3 years at most. When the influenza came, it did not kill her. It simply accelerated an inevitable process." Thomas lowered his voice further. "Alexander has never forgiven himself for failing to understand that her refusal to accept care was not stubbornness, but rather a merciful shortening of a process that would have been far more agonizing if prolonged." Margaret felt something shift in her chest, a reorganization of understanding that altered the entire landscape of the Duke's guilt and fear. "He does not know that you know this," Thomas continued. "I told him the full account only after Eleanor had been dead for 2 years. He refused to believe me, said I was attempting to ease his conscience. Perhaps he has reconsidered, perhaps not." The guest list for dinner that evening was extensive, and Margaret found herself seated at the table across from the Duke, rather than beside him, a formal arrangement designed to prevent the appearance of unseemly intimacy. She was acutely aware of him throughout the meal, the way he moved with his characteristic control, the way his eyes occasionally found hers and then quickly looked away, the way one of the visiting daughters was attempting to engage his attention with marked unsuccess. After dinner, as was customary, the gentlemen remained for port while the ladies withdrew to the drawing-room. Margaret occupied herself with needlework and listened to the visiting daughters discuss in exhaustive detail the various merits of their respective suitors. It was near midnight when the Duke appeared in the drawing-room. He did not speak immediately. He simply stood observing the assembled women with the expression of a man contemplating a particularly tedious philosophical problem. "Duchess," he said, his voice carrying enough authority that every head turned, "I wonder if you might spare yourself from society for a brief respite. The library requires attention, and I find myself in need of your particular expertise on a matter of cataloguing." It was a transparent excuse, and every person in the drawing-room understood it to be so. Margaret felt heat rise in her face, but she rose without hesitation. "Of course, Your Grace," she said coolly. The library was dim, lit only by the fire in the hearth. The Duke closed the door behind them with finality. "I apologize for the impropriety," he said without preamble, "but I found myself unable to maintain the pretense of indifference a moment longer. Thomas told you about Eleanor, about the consumption. It was not a question, and Margaret did not insult him by pretending otherwise. "He did," she said. "I am sorry he felt it necessary to reveal something you had not chosen to share. He revealed it because I am a fool who has spent years believing a lie," the Duke said harshly, "because I have constructed an entire fortress of guilt on the foundation of a misunderstanding that Eleanor herself would have corrected had I possessed the capacity to truly listen to her." He moved away from Margaret, toward the shelves of Eleanor's books. His hand traced the spines as if he could communicate with his dead wife through the physical connection with her possessions. "I am afraid," he said quietly, addressing the books rather than Margaret, "that if I allow myself to love you fully, if I permit myself to believe that this marriage is something other than a necessary arrangement, I am engaging in a betrayal of Eleanor's memory. That by moving forward I am diminishing what we had." "Did Eleanor love you?" Margaret asked. "I believed so," he said, "though I was far less certain toward the end." "Then she would not wish for you to be destroyed by her death," Margaret said. "No woman who loved genuinely would wish that upon her husband." The Duke turned to face her. In the firelight, Margaret could see the lines of his face, the marks of grief and isolation. But beneath them, she could also see something else. The man who had caught her falling wineglass, who had overruled his mother's instructions, who had taught her to think of his hands as capable of gentleness as well as control. "I do not know how to love without destroying," he said. "I did not destroy Eleanor. She destroyed herself. And I fear, Margaret, that if I permit myself to love you as I am increasingly inclined to do, I will find a way to destroy you as well." "Then have faith," Margaret said, moving toward him. "Have faith that I am strong enough to withstand whatever destruction you fear. Have faith that love, by its very nature, creates more than it destroys." She was close to him now, close enough that she could see the storm in his eyes, the battle between desire and fear, between the man he had become and the man he wished to be. "You ask a great deal," he said. "I ask precisely what you are capable of giving," she replied. "I ask for the man who sings lullabies to children, for the man who defies his mother, for the man who speaks my name in the darkness." He lifted his hand, and for a moment Margaret thought he would touch her. Instead, he traced the line of her cheek with fingers that barely made contact, a gesture of such infinite tenderness that it broke something inside her. "Very well," he said, his voice barely audible. "I will attempt faith. But Margaret, if I fail, if I somehow hurt you, I do not know if I could survive that particular failure." "You will not fail," she said. And in that moment, standing in the library surrounded by Eleanor's books, Margaret chose to believe it. The Duke lowered his hand, and together they returned to the drawing room and to the performance of propriety that society demanded. But something fundamental had shifted between them. The distance was no longer a wall, but rather a choice, and for the first time it felt like a choice that might be overcome. The house party had settled into its second week with the kind of relentless social obligation that left no room for genuine respite. Breakfasts were protracted affairs, where gentlemen discussed the merits of various hunting strategies, while ladies feigned interest. Afternoons brought card games and needlework in the drawing room, the latter occupation providing excellent cover for the observation of interpersonal dynamics. Evenings consisted of dinner, music, and the careful orchestration of social hierarchies. Through it all, Margaret was acutely aware that she and the Duke were being studied with the intensity of naturalists examining specimens of unusual interest. The visiting daughters, initially hopeful that the Duke might prove receptive to their advances, had adjusted their strategies after observing the particular quality of attention he paid to Margaret. It was subtle, a glance sustained perhaps a fraction longer than propriety dictated, the way his body aligned slightly toward her when they occupied the same space, the particular care he took to ensure she was comfortable before attending to his own requirements. Thomas, who had positioned himself in a chair opposite Margaret's during one particularly tedious afternoon of needlework, leaned forward with an expression of studied casualness that fooled no one who possessed actual powers of observation. "I am given to understand," he said quietly, his voice pitched below the general conversation of the assembled women, "that you and Alexander have developed something approaching actual affection for one another. This represents a significant transformation from the arrangement I understood existed." Margaret's needle did not falter in its progress through the linen, though her heart executed an irregular pattern that would have been alarming had she permitted herself to examine it closely. "I cannot speak to His Grace's sentiments," she said carefully. "I can only observe that we have achieved a companionable understanding." "You are being appropriately circumspect," Thomas acknowledged, "which is precisely what society demands. However, I am asking you as someone who values Alexander's well-being and who suspects you share that value. Is he capable of genuine healing, or is he simply performing the role of a man in transition while remaining fundamentally unchanged?" Margaret set down her needlework and met his eyes directly. "That would depend entirely upon his willingness to believe that he deserves healing, and upon his capacity to distinguish between the past and the present." Thomas's expression shifted into something more solemn. Eleanor spent considerable time attempting to convince him that he was not responsible for her choices. She failed. I hope you will succeed where she did not. I am not Eleanor, Margaret said, echoing words she had spoken months prior in an entirely different context. And he is not the man he was when he loved her. People transform, Lord Blackstone. It is sometimes possible for them to become better versions of themselves. That evening, as the assembled company was preparing to retire, the Duke requested that Margaret join him in his study, a space she had never been invited to occupy. The request was delivered with enough formality that no one questioned its propriety, though Margaret was acutely aware of the speculative glances that followed them from the drawing room. The study was exactly as she would have imagined it, precisely organized, lined with books and papers, bearing no decorative elements beyond those that served a practical purpose. A fire burned in the hearth, and the Duke had arranged 2 chairs before it, with what appeared to be considerable deliberation. I have become aware, he said without preamble, that society is observing the progression of our marriage with interest that borders on invasive. The visiting daughters have apparently concluded that I am incapable of providing them with the romantic attention they seek, which I credit to your presence. The elderly aunts have been discussing, in whispers they imagine are discreet, the possibility that you are already with child, which seems to them the only logical explanation for my apparent contentment, and Thomas is watching me as if I am an experiment in the possibility of redemption. Margaret settled herself in the chair he had arranged, suddenly aware that her heart had begun to perform that irregular motion again. I suspect, she said, that Lord Blackstone is observing you because he cares for you and wishes to ensure you are not engaging in performance rather than genuine transformation. I am aware of his motivations, the Duke replied, and there was something almost like humor in his tone. However, his observations raise an important question. Are you content with the current state of our marriage? Or are you, like society, awaiting some definitive transformation that will serve as evidence that we have achieved something beyond mere civil cohabitation? Margaret considered her answer with the care it deserved. The distance between the chairs seemed suddenly significant, not a barrier, but rather a space that could be bridged if they both chose to move toward it. I am content, she said finally, with the genuine affection that has developed between us. I would not object to its deepening, but I am aware that deepening requires vulnerability from you, and I am not certain you are prepared to offer it. The Duke rose and moved to the window, his silhouette outlined against the darkness beyond. Do you know what I fear most? He asked, his voice barely audible. It is not loss. I have already experienced loss, and I have survived it. What I fear most is discovering that my capacity to love is fundamentally flawed, that I am somehow broken, in a way that makes it impossible for me to love without causing damage. You are not broken, Margaret said, and she rose as well, moving to stand beside him at the window. You are afraid. There is a significant distinction. He turned to face her, and in the dim light filtering from the fireplace, Margaret could see the vulnerability that lived beneath his carefully constructed exterior. I would like to kiss you, he said, the words emerging with evident difficulty. I have wanted to for considerably longer than I am comfortable admitting, but I am afraid that if I begin to express my feelings in that manner, I will lose the capacity to stop. I will become consumed by wanting, and in that consumption I may become the destructive force I fear most. Then perhaps, Margaret said softly, you should permit me to initiate. Perhaps that would provide you with greater control. She lifted her hand to his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw with a care that mirrored the way he had touched her in the library. He did not move away. His breathing became shallow, his eyes darkened, but he did not move away. Margaret, he said, her name emerging as something between a question and a surrender. She leaned forward and pressed her lips to his with a gentleness that belied the intensity of emotion she felt. It was not a passionate kiss. There was no claiming, no possession, no demand. It was rather a confirmation, a yes in response to every unspoken question he had asked about his capacity to be loved. When she withdrew, his eyes remained closed for a long moment. When he opened them, Margaret saw something that looked almost like peace. I fear I may be falling in love with you, he said. I know, she replied. I have been in love with you for considerably longer. He reached out and drew her back to him, but this time it was her that he held, her head against his chest, his hand cradling the back of her neck with infinite gentleness. They stood together at the window, watching the darkness beyond. Two people who had learned to survive isolation, discovering that survival and living were not the same thing. Marry me again, he said softly. Not in the chapel with the vicar, but truly. Choose me. choose this. I choose you, Margaret said into the silence. I have been choosing you every day since you caught my falling wine glass. The morning after the kiss, though they had done nothing beyond that single gesture of affection, held carefully within the bounds of propriety, Margaret woke with the curious sensation of having been reborn. The light filtering through her windows seemed brighter. The sounds of the household moving through its morning routines seemed more vivid. Everything appeared to have gained a kind of crystalline clarity that suggested the previous months of her life had been lived in shadow. She was dressing when a knock came at her door. Unusual in itself, Mrs. Hartley did not knock. The house staff did not knock. The knock suggested someone of equal or superior status, and Margaret found herself nervous in a way that she had not been in months. The Dowager Duchess stood in the doorway, her expression even more severe than usual, her eyes carrying the kind of intensity that suggested she had detected something requiring immediate correction. "I would speak with you, Duchess," she said, using Margaret's title in a way that somehow managed to suggest disapproval. Privately, Margaret directed Mrs. Hartley to attend to other duties and indicated that the Dowager should enter. What followed was a conversation that Margaret would replay in her mind for days, examining it from multiple angles like a jeweler studying a flawed stone. "I am aware," the Dowager began, "of certain developments in your relationship with my son. I have observed the changes in his demeanor, the particular attentiveness he displays toward your presence, the manner in which he appears to have shifted from his necessary observance of duty toward something that approximates genuine emotion." Margaret said nothing. She had learned that the Dowager's statements were frequently declarations rather than invitations to conversation. "This concerns me greatly," the Dowager continued. "Alexander made a conscious decision after Eleanor's death to remove himself from the possibility of emotional entanglement. This was a wise decision. The death of his first wife demonstrated the instability that occurs when one permits one's judgment to be compromised by sentiment. I fear you are undoing years of careful reconstruction." "I fear," Margaret said carefully, "that I am not responsible for your son's emotional development. His Grace is a man of considerable agency. If he has chosen to permit himself to feel, that choice belongs entirely to him." "He did not choose," the Dowager said sharply. "He was seduced into it. And I suspect you did the seducing, deliberately, recognizing his vulnerability and exploiting it for your own purposes." Margaret felt heat rise in her face, not from shame but from the intensity of her indignation. "I have not exploited his Grace in any manner whatsoever. I have been patient, respectful, and appropriately constrained in my behavior." "You have been a seductress," the Dowager said flatly. "Eleanor was a seductress as well, beautiful in her own way, accomplished, intelligent, all qualities designed to appeal to a man who values intellect. She used these qualities to draw my son into emotional territory where he was fundamentally unsuited to operate. And when she died, when her death destroyed the fragile equilibrium he had constructed, he was devastated in a way that nearly cost him his sanity." Margaret understood in that moment the full extent of the Dowager's fear. It was not disapproval of Margaret's presence, but rather terror that her son might be destroyed again. "Eleanor did not deliberately harm your son," Margaret said quietly. "She was a woman with her own struggles, her own fears. She loved him to the best of her capacity. And his Grace loved her, despite the pain that love ultimately caused. But that pain does not diminish the value of the love itself." "It absolutely diminishes it," the Dowager replied. "It renders it destructive, and I will not stand by while you replicate Eleanor's mistakes and expose my son to similar devastation." "With respect, madam, you do not possess the authority to govern your son's choices regarding his own heart," Margaret said, and she was surprised by the steadiness in her voice. "You may disapprove of his capacity to feel. You may fear the consequences of that capacity, but you cannot prevent it without becoming tyrannical in a way that I suspect you would find distasteful." The Dowager's expression hardened further. "If my son is destroyed by this alliance, I will hold you personally responsible, and I possess the resources and social standing to ensure that you feel the consequences of that destruction quite keenly." She left without waiting for a response, and Margaret found herself shaking with a mixture of emotions that she could not entirely categorize. Anger, certainly. Fear, undoubtedly, but also something that might have been determination. That afternoon, Thomas found her in the library, the public library, not the hidden sanctuary that belonged to the Duke's memories. He settled himself in the chair across from her with his characteristic ease, though his expression suggested that ease was somewhat performative. "The Dowager," he said without preamble, "has apparently decided that you represent a threat to Alexander's well-being. She spent 20 minutes this morning attempting to convince me that I should use my friendship with him to encourage him toward emotional distance from you." "I gathered as much," Margaret said dryly. "She made her opinions quite clear to me directly." "What did you tell her?" "That her son is capable of making his own choices, that fear should not dictate another person's emotional development, that love, despite its risks, is worth pursuing." Thomas nodded slowly. "Those were excellent statements. However, I wonder if you are prepared for the consequences of making them. The Dowager does not forgive easily, and she has considerable influence within society. If she chooses to spread rumors, to question your character, to suggest that you are responsible for Alexander's emotional vulnerability, well, such things have destroyed reputations before." "I cannot govern my actions based on the Dowager's potential for malice," Margaret said, though her stomach was executing an uncomfortable contraction. "That would be precisely the kind of fear-based existence that your Grace suggested would be destructive." "Admirable," Thomas said, "and possibly foolish. But admirable nonetheless." He paused. "How does Alexander feel about his mother's concerns?" "He does not know that she has expressed them," Margaret admitted. "I have not told him." "Then you should," Thomas said firmly. "He needs to understand that his choice to permit himself to love you will likely result in conflict with his mother. He needs to be prepared to defend that choice, not discover it belatedly through overheard conversation or society gossip." That evening, Margaret requested a private meeting with the Duke, and they retired once again to his study. She approached the conversation with the same care she would approach a dangerous animal, aware that a single misstep could result in considerable harm. "Your mother," she began, "has concerns about the development of our relationship. She believes you are vulnerable to emotional entanglement, and that I am deliberately exploiting that vulnerability." The Duke's expression shifted from surprise to something darker. "My mother shared this assessment with you?" "She did," Margaret confirmed. "She also suggested that she would use her social influence to harm me if she perceived that I was causing you pain." "She threatened you?" His voice carried an edge that Margaret recognized as fury, though it was controlled, directed, precisely calibrated. "She warned me," Margaret corrected gently, "which is not quite the same thing." The Duke rose and began pacing the study, with the kind of controlled energy that suggested he was containing significant emotion. "My mother," he said, his voice tight, "has spent the last 6 years attempting to convince me that my capacity to feel is destructive, that the safest course is perpetual isolation, and now that I have discovered otherwise, she is attempting to reinforce her teachings through threats directed at you. She is afraid," Margaret said softly. "She watched Eleanor's death devastate you. She is terrified of witnessing similar devastation occur again. Then she should have greater faith in my capacity to navigate my own emotional landscape," he said sharply. "I am not a child requiring protection from dangerous impulses. I'm a man making a conscious choice to permit myself to love, and that choice happens to be directed toward you." He stopped his pacing and turned to face her. "I wish to inform my mother that we are anticipating the possibility of children. This will serve to emphasize the legitimacy and permanence of our union in ways that society values. It may also provide her with sufficient reassurance regarding our relationship that she will cease her threats." Margaret felt her breath catch. "Your Grace, I am not currently with child. If we were to claim such anticipation, and it did not come to pass, then we will state that we were mistaken," he said calmly, "or we will ensure that the claim becomes reality in a manner that is not yet possible." The meaning beneath his words was unmistakable, and Margaret felt heat rise in her face. They had not yet moved beyond kisses and carefully controlled physical expressions of affection. The suggestion that they should move toward actual consummation of the marriage was significant, both a declaration of faith and a risk of considerable magnitude. "Are you certain?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am terrified," he admitted, "but I am beginning to understand that terror and love are not mutually exclusive emotions, and I love you sufficiently that I am willing to risk the terror." He moved toward her and took her hand, raising it to his lips in a gesture that was formal, and yet somehow contained all the emotion that words could not express. "I wish to make you truly my wife," he said, "not in name only, as has been our arrangement, but in every way that marriage can encompass, if you are willing." "I am willing," Margaret said, and knew that with those words she was crossing a threshold from which there could be no return. The guests were required to leave within the next 3 days. Social custom dictated that house parties maintain a duration of no greater than 2 weeks, and the assembly had already extended to nearly that limit. Margaret found herself in a curious state of anticipation, aware that once the household had returned to its normal occupation, she and the Duke would take the final steps of their marriage's consummation. It was a state of mind that apparently did not escape notice. On the evening before the guests' scheduled departure, one of the visiting daughters, a girl of perhaps 19 years with blonde hair and the kind of conventional beauty that society celebrated, approached Margaret during the drawing-room portion of the evening. "I wonder if I might speak with you, Your Grace," the girl said, her voice pitched to avoid the notice of the assembled women, but not quite succeeding. Regarding a matter of some delicacy, Margaret excused herself from the conversation she had been engaged in with Thomas and moved to a quieter corner of the room. The visiting daughter, Miss Beatrice something, Margaret recalled, though the visiting daughters had begun to blur into one another some days prior, appeared nervous, which was unusual for someone of her evident social confidence. "I have been told," Miss Beatrice began, "by several persons whose judgment I trust, that you are likely anticipating a child, that His Grace has indicated the probability of such an event occurring in the near future." Margaret felt something cold settle in her stomach. Information had somehow travelled from the Duke's stated intentions to the gossiping masses with remarkable speed. "That would be a matter between myself and His Grace," Margaret said carefully. "Of course," Miss Beatrice agreed. "However, I find myself in the position of being grateful to you, Your Grace. Prior to your marriage, I had hoped, that is to say, several of us hoped, that His Grace might eventually marry again, and we were inclined to position ourselves as potential candidates. But watching the manner in which he regards you, it has become clear that any such aspiration would have been futile." She paused, and when she continued, her voice carried something almost like sincerity. "You are good for him. I confess I did not initially believe so. But I see now that you have brought him back to life. That is a considerable achievement." After Miss Beatrice had returned to the general conversation, Margaret remained in her corner of the drawing-room, processing the revelation that the Duke's declaration regarding children had apparently spread through the household staff with the efficiency of wildfire. When she was finally able to extract herself from society and retire to her chambers, she found the Duke waiting in her private sitting room, a breach of propriety so significant that it suggested something momentous was approaching. "The servants are discussing our anticipation of children," she said without preamble. "The visiting daughters are aware of it. And I suspect that by tomorrow afternoon, the entire county will have received notification, through whatever mysterious channels society employs, for the dissemination of such information." "That was my intention," the Duke said. "Public declaration serves multiple purposes. It reinforces the legitimacy of our union. It provides my mother with reassurance regarding the permanence of our relationship, and it establishes a narrative that will protect your reputation should we be observed together in circumstances that might otherwise invite speculation." "You have orchestrated this entire situation," Margaret said, and there was more wonder in her tone than accusation. "I have considered the strategic implications," he corrected gently. "I have spent enough of my life permitting events to control me. I decided that in this instance I would control the narrative, rather than allow it to control us." He rose and moved toward her, and Margaret became acutely aware that her entire body had begun to anticipate his proximity in ways that were entirely involuntary. "The guests will depart tomorrow," he said. "My mother will return to the East Wing, satisfied by the promise of grandchildren and the apparent stability of our marriage, and we will finally be alone in a way that permits us to complete what was begun at our wedding, but prevented by circumstance and emotion." "You are very certain of my intentions," Margaret said, though her heart was executing a rhythm that suggested she was not nearly as composed as her words indicated. "I am certain only of my own," he replied, "which is why I am asking you, Margaret, with full knowledge of the implications and the permanence, do you wish to be my wife in the truest sense, or shall we continue in the arrangement that has served us adequately, if incompletely?" Margaret found that she could not quite meet his eyes. The question was too significant, the implications too vast, the vulnerability it required too absolute. "I have never," she said softly, "been with a man in that manner. I have no understanding of what will be required of me." "Then I will teach you," the Duke said, and his voice carried a gentleness that should not have been possible from a man of his controlled exterior. "Just as I have taught you to trust that I am not the severe, emotionally unavailable man you believed me to be when you arrived at Ashford." I will demonstrate that tenderness is not weakness, that passion need not be destructive, that you are safe with me in ways that extend beyond the protection of my title and name." He reached out and took her hand, and Margaret observed with a kind of detached wonder that her fingers were trembling. "When the guests have departed," he said, "I will come to you if you wish me to, if you believe that we are ready, and if you do not, I will not push. I will continue to love you within the boundaries you set. But Margaret, I wish to love you without restraint. I wish to love you in ways that cannot be accomplished while we maintain separate chambers and careful distance." After he had left, Margaret remained in her sitting room for several hours, conscious of the trembling in her hands, the irregular pattern of her breathing, the profound sense that her life was about to transform in ways both terrifying and inevitable. She thought of Eleanor, the woman whose absence still inhabited the house like a ghost. She wondered if Eleanor had felt this anticipatory fear, this mixture of desire and trepidation, this sense of standing at a precipice. And then she made a decision. She rose, moved to her wardrobe, and began removing the pins from her hair. She selected a nightgown of pale silk, not the serviceable cotton she usually wore, but something that she had received in her trousseau and never worn, something that hinted at feminine softness without appearing vulgar. She was, she decided, ready to cross the threshold from widow to wife, from arrangement to commitment, from the woman she had been to the woman she was becoming. When the knock came at her door near midnight, Margaret opened it to find the Duke standing in the corridor. He was dressed simply, having removed the formal layers of the evening. His hair was damp, suggesting he had bathed, and his eyes held an expression of such hunger and tenderness in equal measure that Margaret understood in that moment the true power of what they were about to undertake. "Come in," she said softly, and watched as he crossed the threshold of her chamber, closing the door behind him with a finality that suggested there would be no retreat from the choice they had both made. Morning arrived with a quality of light that seemed entirely different from the mornings that had preceded it. Margaret became aware of consciousness gradually, moving from the depths of sleep to wakefulness with a languor that was entirely unfamiliar. Every part of her body existed in a state of heightened sensitivity. Her skin was aware of the sheets in ways it had never been before. Her muscles carried a pleasant ache that spoke of usage. Her mind existed in a state of soft confusion that made coherent thought nearly impossible. The Duke was not beside her. She understood this without opening her eyes, some instinctive knowledge of the space around her, indicating his absence. Margaret allowed herself a moment of disappointment before acknowledging the practical necessity of his departure. He could not be discovered in her chambers when the house staff began their morning routine. Such a discovery, regardless of the technical legitimacy of their union, would create exactly the kind of scandal that Margaret had hoped to avoid. When she finally opened her eyes and assessed the evidence of the previous night, the tangled sheets, her nightgown discarded upon the floor, the faint marks upon her shoulder where his lips had found sensitive skin, she felt heat rise in her face despite being entirely alone. They had not, she reflected with a mixture of embarrassment and wonder, been particularly restrained. What the Duke had promised regarding tenderness was accurate. There had been moments of exquisite gentleness, times when he had paused to ensure she was not in pain, instances where his control seemed to have been tested and carefully maintained. But there had also been moments where tenderness had transformed into something more passionate, where his need for her had become evident in ways that words could not entirely capture, where she had discovered that her own capacity for desire was considerably greater than she had imagined possible. Margaret rose carefully, aware that her body was complaining in ways that were both pleasant and uncomfortable. She dressed in a simple morning gown and took considerable care with her hair, aware that she could not permit the household staff to observe evidence of the previous night's activities. Her face in the mirror was subtly transformed. There was a softness in her expression that had not been present before, an awareness in her eyes that suggested she had experienced something significant. Breakfast was served in the morning room, and Margaret found herself simultaneously hoping and fearing that the Duke would appear. What would be the appropriate manner of greeting after such an encounter? What comportment was expected of a woman who had moved from the status of wife in name only to an actual marriage? The Duke entered precisely at the time he usually took his morning meal, his appearance giving no indication of sleeplessness or emotional disruption. He greeted her with a courtesy that was barely distinguishable from his usual formality, though Margaret detected something in his eyes, a satisfaction perhaps, or a deepening of whatever affection he had previously demonstrated. "The guests will depart after luncheon," he said, settling himself at the breakfast table with characteristic control. "My mother plans to return to the East Wing this afternoon. I suspect we shall have the house largely to ourselves by evening." "Yes," Margaret said, and was annoyed at herself for the breathlessness in the single word. "I trust you are well this morning," he continued, and there was something almost like humor in the question. It was posed as a general inquiry about her health, but they both understood that it contained considerably more meaning. "I am well," Margaret confirmed. "Very well." Throughout the morning, as the guests made their final preparations for departure, Margaret found herself acutely aware of the Duke's presence. When he appeared in the drawing room as she was saying farewell to the visiting daughters, she found herself conscious of how his eyes tracked her movement. When he assisted the guests into their carriages, she observed the ease with which he managed social obligation while maintaining his characteristic reserve. And she understood, with a clarity that felt almost like revelation, that she had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of his severity. His control was not the absence of feeling, but rather the careful management of considerable feeling. He was not emotionally unavailable, but rather deeply aware of the consequences of emotional expression, and therefore careful regarding its deployment. By late afternoon, the household had returned to its normal occupation. The servants had attended to the departure of guests and the restoration of the drawing room to its usual state. The dowager, despite Margaret's expectations of attempted confrontation, had simply departed with the announcement that she was fatigued and required the solitude of the East Wing. It was a retreat that Margaret recognized as capitulation. The dowager had accepted the reality of their marriage and had chosen withdrawal rather than continued conflict. As evening approached, Margaret was in her chambers selecting a dinner gown when Mrs. Hartley brought her a note. It was written in the Duke's hand and contained only a single line: "The library, after dinner. Come to me." That evening's dinner was conducted with a formality that seemed almost laughable in its propriety. The Duke and Margaret sat at the table as if they were distant acquaintances rather than people who had spent the previous night in considerable physical intimacy. They discussed the weather. They commented upon the departing guests. They maintained the elaborate performance of propriety that society demanded. But beneath the table, Margaret was acutely aware of the tension that existed between them, a tension that was no longer the cautious distance of two people uncertain of one another, but rather the charged awareness of two people who had tasted intimacy and were awaiting its recurrence. When dinner concluded, Margaret excused herself to her chambers, changed into a nightgown and wrapper, and made her way to the library, the hidden library that belonged to Eleanor's memory, the space that the Duke had shared with her in confidence. He was waiting, and there were candles burning that suggested he had arranged the space with deliberation. The fire burned in the hearth, casting shadows that danced across the shelves of books. "I brought you here," he said without preamble, "because I wish to integrate all the aspects of who I am. Eleanor lives in these books. Her voice speaks through her annotations. Her thoughts are preserved in her papers. And now I wish for you to understand that loving you does not diminish the love I had for her. It simply means that I have learned to hold multiple truths simultaneously, that I loved her, that she is gone, and that I am capable of loving you in ways that are entirely distinct from what I felt before." He moved toward Margaret, and she saw vulnerability in his expression that she had not seen even during their physical intimacy the previous night. "I do not expect you to be Eleanor," he said. "I do not wish for you to replace her. I wish for you to exist alongside her memory, not in competition with it. Can you do that? Can you love a man who is haunted by his past while simultaneously moving forward into a future?" "Yes," Margaret said simply. "I can. I do." He drew her toward him, and this time their embrace contained not the desperate passion of the previous night, but rather a quieter intimacy. They stood together in the library surrounded by Eleanor's books, and Margaret understood that the Duke was offering her access to the most private portions of his heart, not just the present self that was learning to love, but the historical self that had loved before and been fundamentally altered by loss. "You asked me once," the Duke said softly, his words spoken into her hair, "why you might choose to love despite the possibility of loss. I believe I finally understand your answer. It is because the alternative, the refusal to love, the deliberate isolation, is a kind of death that is more terrible than any physical loss." "Yes," Margaret said, and held him close, understanding that they had finally moved beyond the architecture of duty into the genuine construction of partnership. Spring arrived at Ashford Hall with a subtlety that belied its significance. The gardens began to show evidence of emerging life. Small green shoots pushing through soil that had been frozen for months, the tentative appearance of snowdrops and crocuses, the slow transformation from dormancy to growth. And with the arrival of spring came social season in London, the assertion that it was now acceptable to venture forth from country houses and resume the elaborate dance of society balls and dinner parties. It was a letter from London that precipitated what would be the final test of their newly formed union. The Duke received it during breakfast, and Margaret observed the subtle shift in his expression as he read its contents. His jaw tightened. His eyes moved more rapidly across the page than their usual measured pace. When he looked up, she saw something that might have been alarm. "The Duke and Duchess of Pemberton have issued an invitation," he said, his tone carefully neutral, "to a dinner party of notable distinction. They have specifically requested that we attend, suggesting that our presence would bring considerable prestige to their gathering." "That is an honor," Margaret ventured carefully, understanding that his tone suggested complication beyond the mere extension of an invitation. "The Duke of Pemberton," the Duke continued, "was Eleanor's cousin. The invitation was likely issued as an acknowledgement of our new marriage and as a gesture of social reacceptance. It is an opportunity to demonstrate to society that we have moved beyond the years of withdrawal and isolation that followed Eleanor's death." "Yet you appear troubled by this opportunity," Margaret observed. "I am troubled," he admitted, "by the possibility that your appearance in London society will be greeted with speculation. There will be those who question your adequacy to the position. There will be others who will assess you in comparison to Eleanor, finding you either superior or inferior, depending upon their various prejudices and loyalties." Margaret set down her teacup with deliberate care. "Do you wish to attend this dinner party?" "I am asking what you wish," he replied. "I will not obligate you to enter society if you believe it will cause you distress." "But you wish to attend," Margaret said. It was not a question. She could see that beneath his careful exterior he wanted this opportunity. He wanted to demonstrate that he was no longer the man who had withdrawn from the world in his grief. He wanted society to witness that he had transformed. "Yes," he admitted, "I wish to attend. More importantly, I wish to attend with you beside me. I wish for society to see that my marriage is not a duty accomplished, but a genuine partnership. I wish for Eleanor's family to understand that I have found my way toward happiness without diminishing the love I had for her." "Then we shall attend," Margaret said, and watched something settle in his expression, a sense of resolution, perhaps, or acceptance that this particular bridge was about to be crossed. The weeks before the dinner party were consumed with preparation of a kind that Margaret had not anticipated. There were new gowns to be commissioned. There was instruction regarding the particular protocols of London's more elevated social circles. There were conversations with the Duke regarding the specific individuals who would be present at the gathering and the historical dynamics that might influence their reception. And there were private conversations with the Duke regarding his anxieties, his hopes, and the weight of what this particular evening represented. 3 days before they were scheduled to depart for London, Margaret discovered the Duke standing in the hidden library, holding one of Eleanor's journals. He was reading with such concentration that he did not notice her entrance. "I am reading her account of our courtship," he said, not looking up. "I have avoided these pages for 6 years, but I thought it time to understand Eleanor's perspective on what I had always believed to be primarily my experience." "What does she say?" Margaret asked gently. "She says," he replied slowly, "that she was afraid, that she loved me but was terrified of the depth of that love because she knew that her illness meant she could never give me what I deserved. She states quite clearly that her refusal to accept medical care was not stubbornness, but rather an act of mercy, a shortening of a process that would have eventually rendered her completely incapacitated." He closed the journal carefully. "I have spent 6 years believing that I failed her. Reading her own account, I understand that she was protecting me, that her death was not a tragedy I could have prevented, but rather a choice she made with love and intention." "That must be difficult to accept," Margaret said softly. "It is transformative," he corrected, "because it means that I have spent 6 years mourning not only her death, but also a mythology I constructed around her death. And now I must grieve more honestly, not for the wife who was destroyed by my inadequacy, but for the woman I loved who chose her own terms of departure." Margaret moved toward him and took the journal from his hands. She placed it on the shelf alongside the others, creating a small gesture of closure. "You are not the man you were when you married Eleanor," she said. "You are transformed by her, certainly, but you are not defined by her." And you are capable of loving me, not as a replacement for her, but as an entirely distinct person worthy of her own consideration. I know, he said, and there was something almost like peace in the acknowledgement. I believe I have finally come to understand that. The dinner party in London was conducted in a grand ballroom that belonged to the Pembertons, and Margaret found herself acutely aware of the assessment being conducted by the assembled aristocrats. The Duke, she observed, was cognizant of these appraisals as well. But rather than retreating into the severe formality that had once been his default, he remained close to her throughout the evening. He ensured that she was introduced to those of significance. He positioned himself so that his attention to her was evident without being improper. He demonstrated, through countless small gestures, that he valued her presence in ways that transcended mere duty. The climax of the evening came when Eleanor's cousin, the Duke of Pemberton, requested a private audience with the Duke. Margaret remained in the drawing room, uncertain what was about to occur, aware that something significant was approaching. When the Duke returned, his expression had shifted into something that might have been relief. The Pembertons wish to establish a scholarship in Eleanor's name, he explained. They wish my approval, and more importantly, my participation. They understand now that Eleanor's death was her choice, made with full understanding of its consequences. They have forgiven me for the isolation that followed, and they have welcomed our marriage without the caveat of comparison or judgment. Margaret felt tears beginning to form and made no effort to suppress them. You are free, she said. You have finally permitted yourself to be free. Not entirely free, he corrected gently, reaching out to trace a tear from her cheek. I remain bound to Eleanor's memory, but I am free from the belief that loving you somehow diminishes what we had. I am free from the conviction that my survival of her death is somehow a betrayal. I am free to move forward without the weight of mythology crushing me. He drew her into an embrace that was not improper, but also not particularly concerned with propriety. They stood together in the corner of the drawing room, while London society swirled around them, and Margaret understood that they had finally achieved what had seemed impossible months prior. They had built something real from the ruins of duty. They had transformed an arrangement into a partnership. They had created a marriage that honored the past while remaining fully present in the future. I love you, the Duke said softly, and it was perhaps the first time he had spoken those words with complete certainty, without the caveat of fear or the shadowing of ancient grief. Not because you have saved me, but because you have permitted me to save myself. And I love you, Margaret replied, not because you are perfect, but because you have learned to be honest about your imperfections. When they departed London 3 days later, Margaret carried with her the sense that the woman she had been upon arrival at Ashford Hall was not merely transformed, but fundamentally reborn. She was no longer the young woman who had accepted marriage as a duty to be endured. She was the Duchess who was loved by her Duke, who was partner rather than shadow, who had learned that sometimes the greatest gift was simply being seen and chosen despite one's complete awareness of the other's history. Autumn returned to Ashford Hall with the inevitability of seasons turning, bringing with it the kind of golden light that seemed to illuminate everything it touched with a quality of perfection that was both beautiful and fleeting. Margaret found herself particularly aware of this transience, perhaps because the autumn marked the approach of something significant, something that had been anticipated for months, spoken of in careful euphemisms, and which would soon become undeniably real. She was in the morning room, ostensibly occupied with correspondence, when the Duke entered with the kind of purposefulness that suggested he had business of importance requiring her attention. The physician has confirmed what we already suspected, he said without preamble, settling himself into the chair across from her with a care that suggested he was managing his own emotional response with characteristic precision. The child will arrive sometime in November, assuming a normal progression. He has asked that we engage a proper midwife and ensure that we have made adequate preparations. Margaret set down her pen with hands that were trembling only slightly. She had suspected this development for some weeks, the morning nausea, the particular sensitivity to certain scents, the way her body seemed to be transforming in ways both subtle and profound. But hearing it confirmed by the physician felt like witnessing theory becoming concrete reality. Are you well? The Duke asked, his eyes tracking her face with an intensity that suggested he was assessing whether she was experiencing distress or simply processing the magnitude of what was approaching. I am well, Margaret said, and discovered that it was true. The physical symptoms that accompany early expectation of a child were manageable, and the emotional response, a mixture of fear, anticipation, and something that might generously be termed wonder, was overwhelming, but not unpleasant. I am merely aware of how thoroughly my life has transformed in the space of a year. From duty to love, the Duke said quietly, from isolation to partnership, from a woman mourning hopes that seemed irretrievably lost to a woman about to become a mother. He paused. Eleanor could not have children. The weakness that plagued her lungs also affected her capacity to bear a child to term. She grieved this extensively, though she never permitted society to perceive that grief. Margaret understood what he was communicating beneath the surface of his words. He was acknowledging that his marriage to Margaret had provided what his marriage to Eleanor could never provide, the possibility of continuing his line, of creating a family, of building a future that extended beyond himself. I believe, Margaret said carefully, that Eleanor would be glad we found one another, that she would understand this development as neither betrayal nor replacement, but rather as the natural progression of two people discovering how to live after loss. The Duke nodded slowly, and Margaret observed the subtle easing of tension in his shoulders, a sign that he had been carrying anxiety regarding this very conversation. The preparations for the child's arrival consumed considerable attention throughout the autumn months. The nursery, which had been closed for years, was opened and renovated. Furniture was selected, bedding was commissioned, and a nursemaid was engaged, a kind woman of middle years who had successfully raised children of her own, and who seemed not to judge the unusual circumstances of the Duke's marriage. The Dowager Duchess, upon learning of the impending arrival, descended from the East Wing with a determination that suggested she intended to ensure that the coming child would be raised with appropriate respect for familial tradition. She brought with her furniture that had belonged to previous generations of Ashford heirs, and she oversaw the arrangement of the nursery with a precision that was only marginally less severe than her usual comportment. To Margaret's surprise, she discovered that the prospect of a grandchild had shifted the Dowager's fundamental relationship to the marriage. The woman who had threatened Margaret months prior seemed to have accepted not only that the marriage was genuine, but that it would produce the continuation of the ducal line. "The child will be a boy," the Dowager announced, with characteristic certainty one afternoon, as she inspected the completed nursery. "The strength of the ducal line ensures it, and he will be named Edmund, after Alexander's paternal grandfather." The Duke, standing beside Margaret, offered no objection to this pronouncement, though Margaret detected something like amusement in the subtle movement of his lips. As November approached, Margaret found herself increasingly aware of the weight of anticipation. Her body was preparing for something that would fundamentally alter her existence, and she was conscious that the Duke, despite his characteristic composure, was managing anxiety regarding the birthing process itself. Childbirth, as any woman of the era understood, carried considerable risk. "If something occurs," he said one evening, as they lay together in the darkness of his chamber, for they now shared a bed without pretense or apology, "if you are harmed in any way by this process, I do not know how I would survive it." "Nothing will occur," Margaret said firmly, though she was aware that certainty was not something she could actually promise. "I am young and healthy. The physician has indicated that there are no complications. I will deliver a healthy child and survive the process with my life and faculties intact." Eleanor believed she would survive, the Duke said quietly. She had considerable confidence in her ability to manage her own body. That confidence did not protect her. "Eleanor was dying of consumption," Margaret reminded him gently. "I am not. And even Eleanor survived childbirth, did she not? It was illness that took her, not the act of becoming a mother." He held her closer, and Margaret understood that fear was not something to be reasoned away, but rather something to be held and acknowledged and ultimately accepted as part of the human condition. When the pains began in the early hours of November 10th, Margaret was initially uncertain whether she was experiencing the early stages of labor or merely the discomfort that had been intermittent throughout the previous month. The Duke, awakened by her restlessness, immediately summoned the midwife and began the careful management of the crisis with the same precision he brought to all aspects of his life. What followed was a period of time that Margaret would later recall as an existence composed primarily of pain and the strange liminal space between consciousness and something else. There were moments of extraordinary intensity, intervals of strange clarity, and periods that seemed to belong to another reality entirely. When the child finally arrived, with a furious cry that suggested considerable lungs and a decided opinion about the trauma of birth, Margaret was profoundly aware that she had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. She had been transformed not merely by love, but by the extraordinary experience of creating life and bringing it into the world. The Duke, when permitted entry to the chamber after the midwife had completed her essential tasks, stood for a long moment, simply observing the child, a boy-child with the Duke's dark hair and, most remarkably, grey eyes that held the intensity of his father's gaze. "Edmund," Margaret said, testing the name that had been predetermined for months. "He is Edmund." The Duke reached out and placed a single finger against the child's impossibly small hand, and Margaret saw something in his expression that transcended words. A man who had been closed to the future, permitting himself to imagine it again. A man who had believed himself incapable of being a father, discovering that he was capable of extraordinary tenderness. "Edmund," he agreed, his voice barely audible. "Welcome to Ashford Hall, Edmund. Welcome to a home that is no longer haunted by the past, but rather illuminated by the future." As Margaret drifted towards sleep, the child nursing with surprising competence at her breast, she understood that the journey that had begun with a marriage of convenience and obligation had culminated in something far more valuable than mere love. It had culminated in the creation of a family, the establishment of a home where grief and joy could coexist, and the proof that sometimes the greatest transformations occur when we permit ourselves to be broken open by another person's vulnerability. 8 years had passed since Edmund's arrival, and Ashford Hall had been transformed in ways that extended far beyond the physical alterations of reopened nurseries and the addition of children's voices to spaces that had long remained silent. The morning room, where Margaret had once spent lonely hours occupied with needlework and the effort of maintaining composure, now contained evidence of active family life, books scattered across tables, a wooden horse that Edmund had been working to master, the sketches that Eleanor, their daughter, born 3 years after Edmund, created with the kind of enthusiastic confidence that suggested she had inherited her mother's willingness to defy convention. Margaret was working on correspondence when the Duke entered with the kind of easy intimacy that had become characteristic of their interactions over the years. He placed a hand upon her shoulder, a gesture so natural that she barely noticed it, and glanced at the letter she was composing. "Correspondence with Lord Blackstone?" he asked, settling himself into the chair beside hers rather than across from it, as had been his earlier custom. "He is attempting to convince us to bring Edmund to London for the season," Margaret replied. "He believes it is time for the boy to be introduced to society and to meet the children of families suitable for future connection." "Edmund is 8 years old," the Duke observed with the kind of dry amusement that Margaret had discovered was her husband's preferred method of expressing contentment. "I suspect Thomas is being somewhat premature regarding matrimonial considerations." "He is always premature," Margaret agreed, "and yet somehow through the sheer force of his conviction, he generally achieves his objectives. I suspect we shall find ourselves in London by autumn, despite all rational resistance." The Duke leaned back in his chair with the relaxed posture of a man who had learned to relinquish control over circumstances that could not meaningfully be altered. "If Thomas insists, we shall go to London. Edmund will make an adequate impression. He has inherited your capacity for genuine engagement with people and my ability to listen without offering unnecessary commentary. Eleanor will likely scandalize someone by sketching the assembled company rather than attending to the proper business of being observed, and you will manage all of this chaos with the kind of graceful composure that has become your trademark." "You paint a rather accurate portrait of our likely trajectory," Margaret admitted, "though you omit your own role in this scenario, which will primarily consist of intimidating anyone who displays unseemly interest in our daughter, while quietly ensuring that everyone understands that our children are valued, not for their utility in establishing connections, but for their inherent worth as people." "That is a more generous interpretation of my character than I deserve," the Duke said, though there was pleasure in the statement. "I maintain that I have become considerably less severe than I was when you arrived at this house." "Considerably less severe, but not entirely reformed," Margaret corrected. "You still frighten the servants when you review accounts with visible disapproval. You still retreat to the library with a book when society becomes too demanding. You still stand at windows observing landscapes as if they contain answers to questions you have not yet formulated. But I do these things with considerably less isolation than before," the Duke pointed out. "Frequently, you are beside me. Often the children interrupt my solitude with requests that I read to them or examine whatever treasure they have discovered in the gardens. My entire existence has been fundamentally altered by the presence of people who require my engagement and offer their engagement in return." They sat in companionable silence for a time, and Margaret became aware that the morning light had shifted, that the hour had advanced beyond what she had anticipated, and that if she was not careful, the morning would dissolve entirely into afternoon without having accomplished a single task she had planned. Yet she did not rise. She remained in her chair beside the Duke, conscious that these quiet moments of shared presence had become precious in ways that neither of them had anticipated when they were younger, and believed that love required constant demonstration and affirmation. Edmund appeared in the doorway of the morning room, his appearance suggesting that he had recently engaged in some form of active play that had resulted in significant disorder of his garments. He carried a small stone with the kind of serious purpose that suggested it was of considerable importance. "Father," he announced without preamble, "I have discovered a stone that Thomas, the gardener, not Lord Blackstone, believes to be quite rare. He has suggested that it might be valuable. Do you possess the knowledge to assess its worth?" The Duke rose and moved toward his son with the kind of attention that Eleanor had once claimed was impossible from a man so fundamentally reserved. He accepted the stone, examined it with appropriate seriousness, and began to discuss its potential origins and characteristics with the kind of genuine engagement that would have surprised the younger version of himself considerably. Eleanor appeared some minutes later, her father's sketchpad in hand, looking for her brother with the determination of someone pursuing a specific objective. "Edmund," she announced, "I have drawn you in an unflattering manner, and I wish to show you the results because Mother indicated that I should seek approval before sharing my artistic assessments with other family members. The sketch captures your left eye as somewhat larger than the right, and your chin appears to be receding in a manner that I suspect is not anatomically accurate. I would like your permission to display this before making corrections." Margaret observed her husband's expression as he examined the sketch that Eleanor presented. It was a rendering that was indeed somewhat unflattering, but which captured something essential about Edmund's essential self with a precision that suggested Eleanor possessed her own particular form of intelligence. "It is accurate regarding your emotional state," the Duke said to Edmund, who was examining the sketch with the kind of serious attention his father had taught him to bring to matters of substance. "You appear somewhat preoccupied and distant. Is this an accurate representation of your current consciousness?" "Perhaps," Edmund admitted. "I was thinking about whether stones improve in value with age, or whether time diminishes their worth." "A philosophical question," the Duke observed, "and one that admits of multiple answers, depending upon one's definition of value. We might discuss this further if you wish, though I suspect the answer will not significantly alter the stone's essential nature." As the children dispersed, Edmund to continue his geological investigations, Eleanor to make the modifications she had already decided upon, Margaret found herself smiling with the kind of contentment that comes from witnessing the person you love, discovering his capacity for genuine engagement with human connection. "You have become an admirable father," she said, not for the first time, but with the sense that the observation was no less true for its repetition. "I have become a man capable of being transformed by the presence of people I love," he corrected. "That is perhaps a more generous assessment than I deserve, and yet it is what I have learned in 8 years of marriage to you and fatherhood of 2 remarkable children." That evening, as Margaret prepared for sleep, she found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this particular moment. She thought of the frightened young woman who had arrived at Ashford Hall, believing that marriage was a duty to be endured. She thought of the man who had existed in emotional exile, convinced that his capacity to love was fundamentally destructive. And she thought of what they had built together, not through the obliteration of the past, but through its careful integration into a present that was generous enough to honor Eleanor's memory, while simultaneously creating space for new love to flourish. The Duke entered the chamber as he did most evenings, and they moved together with the ease of people who had become accustomed to one another's presence in ways that transcended mere familiarity. They had become, she realized, not just partners but fundamentally part of one another, altered by the other's existence in ways that could never be undone. "I love you," he said, as he did most evenings, though the words never diminished in their capacity to move her. "And I love you," she replied, "precisely as you are, precisely as we have learned to become." Outside, spring was settling over Ashford Hall, not the first spring they had experienced together, but perhaps the most complete. The gardens bloomed with flowers that Eleanor and Margaret had planted together. The pathways that Margaret walked were no longer solitary journeys into isolation, but rather routes taken with children holding her hand, or the Duke standing beside her. Ashford Hall was no longer a house of mourning. It had become, through the simple act of permitting love to emerge from grief, a home. And Margaret, who had once accepted marriage as a cage, had discovered that love, genuine, difficult, transformative love, was not imprisonment, but rather the most profound freedom.